Okay, welcome. I want to give you a little bit of background info on the things they carried and the type of story it is and the way that it's written before you head into actually reading chapter 1. So, chapter 1, and actually throughout the book, it's important to note that the story is kind of circular. It's not a linear story. It doesn't start at point A and then go to point B and have this nice, perfect conclusion with every event happening in order. And this chapter is kind of a good example. The first chapter of the book has the same title as the book. So the first chapter, The Things They Carried. The character of Lavender, his death reoccurs over and over throughout the chapter. So this is kind of all intentional throughout the book, and there's a fancy word for it. You will not be tested on this, but just so that you know as I'm referencing it, the term is verisimilitude, and what that means is that Tim O'Brien is writing the story in a way that he wants to convey that it's a true story, even though it's a work of fiction. It is in many ways based on some of his experiences out of Vietnam, but it is not a true memoir. And so having some of this kind of circular story structure gives it a sense of verisimilitude. Likewise, it mimics the monotony, the uncertainty, and the chaos of war, as well as the landscape of Vietnam. You have soldiers coming from all over the United States being sent to Vietnam, but Vietnam has a very different geography and topography, and they're in the middle of the jungle. And the jungle and the heavy monsoon rains can be very disorienting. And so just understand, go into the book knowing that it's not going to be a really linear story the way that maybe Siddhartha was, or Night, or Mockingbird, or any of those books that you've read before. In this first chapter, alternating sections show Lieutenant Cross and introduce the other soldiers. In the next video that I'm going to have you watch before you read, or as you start reading chapter 1, you'll be focusing on the key characters that are in the platoon, and these will be the characters that we follow throughout the book. So sometimes the book takes place actually in Vietnam during the war, and then occasionally the book will have flashbacks where it's addressing our narrator, whose name is also Tim O'Brien. It'll be addressing our narrator and what he's doing before the war, like when he's drafted. Or the next chapter, chapter 2, but the next chapter titled, I believe it's Love. Lieutenant Cross comes to visit Tim O'Brien. And so this is many years later, and they're looking back at the war. So just kind of get that mindset going where you know that different chapters are going to take place at different times. Look for some of those clues as to, where in time each chapter is. Another thing to address, as I've said, with the verisimilitude. So Tim O'Brien is the author, but Tim O'Brien is also the name of our narrator. That also lends a certain sense of verisimilitude. And I've heard interviews with the actual O'Brien. I've read quite a few of his books. They're so good. I'm a little sad that we're not together to read this because I was so looking forward to it all year. I think it's such a very good book. And he felt like this blurred line between what's fiction and what's nonfiction captures the Vietnam War pretty well, captures his experience and his memories. The Vietnam War is always with him and yet seems like another lifetime ago, and so time is kind of blurred for him. Pay attention to, in this chapter, the things they carried, the soldiers, the things they carried physically and emotionally. So there's some metaphorical and literal things that they carried. And I'm going to ask you throughout reading this book to consider some of those physical and and emotional or metaphorical and literal things that you carry in your life. So think, as you're reading this first chapter, it's going to list, they carry pocket knives or a Bible, versus carrying hope or fear, carrying suntan lotion, versus sometimes he speaks very metaphorically, versus carrying the weight of memory. So pay attention to these things because they all very much make up these characters and make up what's going on in Vietnam at the time. Likewise, some of the things that they carry are very practical, suntan lotion, and some of them tell us much more about those characters. For instance, Ted Lavender carries tranquilizers because he's scared. He's scared throughout, the entire experience. And so he both mentally and physically kind of has to check out occasionally. Okay, a couple other things before you head into, especially this first chapter, but things to think about throughout. The language and the paragraphing in this first chapter, he sets really clear topic sentences. And that tells you kind of what each section, each passage throughout the first chapter is about. So the things they carried were largely determined by necessity. And then he's going to go, the whole paragraph lists different necessities they carried. Or the next section, they were called legs or grunts. And then they talk about the different roles that they fulfilled. What they carried was partly a function of rank, partly a function of field specialty. And then that section talks about the different aspects of rank and things like that. So as much as there is this figurative language, as much as there is this kind of circular story structure to create this verisimilitude, Tim O'Brien is really trying to give you what are called signposts in the writing. So as much as things are a little surreal, he's also trying to give you signposts to help you follow along. We'll talk more about some signposts as we move through the book. Some of you who had me the last couple trimesters, we've done some work on signposts. But one that you will see in this chapter is again and again. It's the title of the signpost. So when you see things repeated, pay attention to that. That's intentional. Why is the author repeating that? What do they want you to pay attention to? So think about that. All right. So I will post another video that goes over the beginning of the first chapter and what your chapter notes should look like and everything like that. So stay tuned and take care.